Hello and welcome. My name is Don Hudson from King University in Bristol, Tennessee. I want to take a few minutes and talk about Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In many ways, I see this as what we would call a spoken exegesis. For some reason or another, you've made your way to this video, and that may mean that you're looking for an understanding of Genesis 1, verse 1. And so let's take a few minutes and go over this verse and kind of see what's going on here. Obviously, this is a very famous verse that most people, even people who haven't grown up in the Judeo-Christian tradition, they know this verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so, very basic verse. However, as usual with almost anything in the Christian scriptures, extremely problematic. So, even as we approach this text, I think it's important to understand that this is a beautiful text. It's a text that most Jews and Christians go back to as a founding myth. And let me be careful with that word. When I use the word myth, for some people that kind of flags, well, it's true or it's false. That's not what myth means, and that's not what I mean by that. Myth is actually a story. It's a founding story. It's a story that tells us who we are, where we're from, and where we're going. And in particular, in Genesis chapter 1, this is a story that many Jews and Christians go back to answer the question, who are we and where are we from? And so I use that term myth in that way. It's a story that gives a foundation to our world. And so in many ways, this is a story, this is a verse that is very beautiful, and it is also a verse that can be problematic. All right, so let's take a look at it. Let's break this verse down. So again, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's very important to understand, even as we come to the very first word in the Hebrew Bible, that in the Hebrew, in the beginning, is actually called Bereshith. Now, this is the Hebrew word, Bereshith. And if you gave this a literal translation, most scholars of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, would say that Bereshith literally means in a beginning. Because, and if you've been to seminary or graduate school, you understand when I talk about the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is the authorized Hebrew or the authorized Hebrew Old Testament. And the Masoretes were scholars who lived and practiced from about 400 to 1400 CE. And Masoretes were the keepers of the tradition. They were the ones who were deeply committed to making sure that we had the best text possible of the Hebrew Bible. And so as keepers of the tradition, they made copies, but they also made edits. And in particular, they put the vowel points into the Hebrew text. And so the Hebrew language, even to this day, is consonants. It's constructed by consonants. And do they have vowels? Well, of course they have vowels, but those vowels are typically in there as vowel points, and this tradition started all the way back to the Masoretes as they were trying to carry on the tradition of the Hebrew language and even how to pronounce and sing the Hebrew Bible. They developed a system called vowel points. And so, why am I talking about this? Even as we come to Genesis 1, verse 1, it's important to understand that we have the text, Bereshith. The vowels were placed there by the Masoretes, and the vowel pointing there does not say in the beginning, it says in a beginning. Now, we need to be careful with this because there's no sense of, well, there were multiple beginnings and it really doesn't matter, and so we can interpret this in a way that would be relativistic. I don't think any Jew or Christian who understands this scripture would say that. What it really means is more of a sense of, and Jews translate it this way, there was a beginning, obviously, but when that beginning was, nobody knows when that time was, according to that word there. But whenever the beginning was, God was there. And so most translations, English translations, look at Genesis 1:1 and they translate it, and you're familiar with this, in the beginning. But the is not there. We have to put the there. So if you read the Tanakh, which is the English translation, you read Genesis 1:1 and it says basically when God created. And I think that's a beautiful translation because what it's saying there is we don't know when the beginning was. And there's so much that we don't know about the beginning. But whenever the beginning was, God was there. Elohim was there. Even as we begin with this first verse, it's important to understand that not only do the words teach us, but what is being said, how it's being said, is teaching us something very important. And both Jews and Christians throughout the centuries have emphasized this. So we begin with Bereshith, which literally translated means in a beginning, or as I've talked about with the Tanakh, probably the best translation, when God created. It has this temporal dimension. And even as we begin, yes, there is a conviction that God was there, absolutely, and then God created, yes, but, and, however, there is also this idea that there is a profound mystery. Bereshith tells us that God was there and God created. And Bereshith teaches us that there is a mystery to this first verse. So when I teach the Old Testament at King, we begin with this verse because obviously it's the beginning, but I also begin with this verse because not only for what it teaches, but what it teaches us in how to read and how to think. So Genesis 1:1, this beautiful verse about God creating the heavens and the earth, and then we'll see later on that God doesn't really do anything, that God basically just speaks the world, speaks creation into existence. And of course, this becomes very important in Judaism and in Christianity. So God doesn't really do any major action. God speaks and the world comes into existence. Creation comes to bear. And so we've got this beautiful verse that is talking about creation and is definitely telling us who we are, where we're from, but it's also telling us that there's a lot that we don't know. And so as we come to this first verse, let this verse teach us that there's good theology and we can go back to this belief that we know where we came from and also we don't know where we came from. Mystery, and that hopefully will give us a profound sense of humility.